most of the Vietnam War, the guerrilla fighters of the South held one advantage that no amount of American firepower could ever quite take from them. They almost always saw the enemy coming. Before a patrol reached a village, before a sweep entered a valley, word had already run ahead of it. A woman working in a paddy field who straightened up a moment too long. A girl who left a basket in a particular place. An old woman who simply was not where she had been an hour before. To the soldiers passing through, these were just civilians, part of the scenery of a country at war. In reality, many of them were the eyes and ears of the insurgency, a vast early warning network woven invisibly through the villages. And a great many of the people in it were women. This network was one of the deadliest weapons the Viet Cong possessed, because it meant the guerrillas rarely had to fight when they did not want to. They knew where you were before you knew they existed. And then, into this country of watching eyes, came a small number of men whose entire purpose was to be the one thing that network could not account, for they did not come to outfight it, they came to be unseen. This is the story of two opposite arts of war, the art of watching everything, and the art of vanishing. And before we go any further, I want to be honest with you about the title of this video, because honesty is the whole reason this channel exists. The title says these women dreaded the Australian SAS, and I am not going to pretend there is some captured diary in which a village lookout writes that she trembled at their name. There isn't. What there is something more interesting and entirely real. The Australian Special Forces were, by deliberate design, the single enemy this all-seeing network was least able to see coming. The dread, if we are going to use that word, was structural, not legendary. It lived in the gap between what these women's system was built to detect and the one kind of soldier built specifically to slip through it. To understand that duel, you first have to understand the network and the women who were its heart. And almost nobody in the English-speaking world ever tells you who they really were. They were part of something the Vietnamese called the long-haired army. It is one of the most extraordinary and least understood forces of the entire war, and the numbers alone should stop you. By some estimates, around 1 million women across the South took part in the struggle alongside the National Liberation Front, the movement the West called the Viet Cong. 1 million. Not as a vague mass of supporters, but in concrete, dangerous roles. They served as scouts and spies, as couriers carrying messages and intelligence through enemy lines, as porters hauling ammunition and supplies along jungle trails, as medics, as propagandists, and in many cases as fighters and guerrillas in their own right. The long-haired army was not a metaphor. It was a real and organized force, and it was central, not marginal, to how the insurgency actually functioned. It had a beginning you can put a date and a place to. It grew out of the uprising movement that swept the province of Ben Tre in 1960, a wave of revolt that spread from there across dozens of communities, and women were at the very center of it from the start. And it had real leaders, real commanders whose names deserve to be known far better than they are. One of the most important figures in the entire Southern insurgency was a woman, a revolutionary who rose to become one of its most senior commanders, helping to lead and organize the armed struggle in the South. Another, a famous guerrilla fighter from the Cu Chi area, rose to be second in command of a fighting battalion in some of the most contested ground of the whole war. These were not symbolic figureheads. They were organizers, strategists, and fighters, operating in a society and a war that gave them every reason to be overlooked and refusing to be. And there was a reason this work fell so heavily and so effectively to women in particular beyond simple numbers. In a war fought among the villages, the most valuable spy is the one no soldier thinks to search. A foreign army moving through rural Vietnam was trained to look for the fighting-age man, the one who might be carrying a weapon, the one who might be Viet Cong. It was not trained to suspect the woman bent over the rice, the girl carrying water, the old grandmother sitting in a doorway. That blind spot was not an accident the women stumbled into. It was a weakness the insurgency understood and deliberately exploited. The very assumptions the enemy carried about who was and was not a threat became the camouflage that let an entire intelligence network operate in plain sight in daylight, a few feet from soldiers who would have been horrified to learn what the harmless-looking figures around them actually were. The long-haired army did not need to hide in the jungle to spy. It hid behind the enemy's own expectations. And here is the part that matters most for our story. For all the roles they played, the most strategically decisive may have been the quietest one. They were the watchers. To understand why that was so powerful, you have to understand how a guerrilla war is actually won and lost. A guerrilla force can almost never win a stand-up fight against a stronger, better-equipped enemy. It survives by choosing its battles, by striking only when it has the advantage and melting away when it does not. And the entire foundation of that ability is information. The single most valuable thing a guerrilla can have is to know where the enemy is, where he is going, and when he will arrive before he gets there. With that knowledge, everything becomes possible. You can set the ambush on the exact trail the patrol will use. You can empty the village before the sweep arrives. You can pull your fighters down into the tunnels and wait in the dark while the soldiers walk overhead and find nothing. Without that knowledge, every one of those weapons fails. An ambush only works if you know the enemy is coming. A tunnel only hides you if you have time to get into it. The early warning network was not a support service. It was the nervous system of the entire insurgency, and a great deal of that nervous system was made up of women whom the passing soldiers never thought to suspect. Think about how perfect that was, and how cruel from the soldiers' point of view. The patrol moving through the countryside saw farmers, mothers, girls, the ordinary life of a rural nation. It could not tell which of them, if any, had already noted its strength, its direction, and its pace, and passed that word quietly down the line so that by the time the patrol reached anywhere that mattered, the enemy had long since decided whether to vanish or to spring a trap. This is the genius of the system. It turned the entire landscape into a set of eyes, and against an army built on size and noise and predictable movement, it was devastatingly effective. The Americans, with their large formations and their heavy equipment and their habit of moving in ways that could be anticipated, were almost impossible to hide from this network. They were exactly the kind of enemy it was built to see. Picture how a single warning actually traveled. A column of soldiers leaves its base in the cool of the early morning. Within minutes, before it has gone a kilometer, a woman who happened to be near the gate has noticed it, counted it roughly, marked its direction. She does not run. She does not look back. She simply goes about her morning, and somewhere along her ordinary path, she passes that knowledge to the next person, who passes it to the next. A chain of glances and small gestures, and a few murmured words that no soldier in the column will ever see or hear. By the time that patrol reaches the area it intends to search, hours later, sweating and alert and certain it has the advantage of surprise, the only people left to find are the ones who chose to be found. The fighters have melted into the tunnels or slipped across the river. Or, far worse, they have not gone anywhere at all, and the patrol is walking into ground that was prepared for it before the men even finished their breakfast. The soldiers never lost a battle to that network in any way they could see. They lost 100 small chances every single day to an enemy that always seemed to know. But the network had never been designed with a particular kind of soldier in mind, because that kind of soldier was so rare and so strange that almost no army on Earth fielded him, and the Australians did. We have talked before on this channel about who the Australian SAS were, and it bears repeating here because their entire craft is the other half of this story. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment did not fight the way other units fought. They operated in tiny patrols, often just 4 to 6 men, and they moved through the jungle more slowly and more carefully than almost anyone else in the war. They did not crash through the undergrowth. They chose every footfall. They did not cut their way through vegetation, because a cut stem weeps sap and catches the light and tells anyone who finds it exactly when a person passed. When a vine snagged on their equipment, they did not pull and tear it free. They stopped and unhooked it by hand. They bent under obstacles rather than breaking through them. They ate cold food so that not even the smell of cooking would betray them. They could lie still and silent for hours, and they could cross a stretch of ground and leave it looking as though no human being had ever been there at all. The enemy is said to have given them a name that captured exactly what they were: the phantoms of the jungle, ghosts. And the reason that craft was the perfect counter to the network is worth sitting with, because it was not about being more aggressive. It was about being more patient. A reconnaissance patrol's job was usually not to fight at all. It was to insert quietly, often by helicopter using deception, to hide where it had really landed, and then to watch. To find a position near a trail or a base and simply observe for days, recording who moved where, when, and in what strength, and then to be extracted without the enemy ever knowing a single soldier had been there. That meant winning a contest the network had no answer for, a contest of stillness. The watchers were experts at noticing movement, noise, and disturbance, the signs that an enemy was passing through. But a soldier who does not move, does not make a sound, leaves nothing disturbed, and is prepared to stay that way for days produces almost nothing for a watcher to notice. The network was tuned to detect an army arriving. It was never built to detect a few men who had decided, with terrifying discipline, to do almost nothing at all. And that is the seam the Australians slipped through. Now put the two halves of this story together, and you can finally see the duel for what it was. On one side, a vast network whose entire purpose was to detect the enemy and pass the warning. On the other, a handful of men whose entire purpose was to move through that network without ever triggering it. Everything the long-haired army's watchers were built to notice: the noise, the broken vegetation, the careless movement, the trail, the smell, the predictable line of march. The SAS were specifically trained to deny them. The network was the art of seeing. The SAS were the art of not being seen. And when those two arts met in the same patch of jungle, something happened that had not happened to that network very often. It failed. That is the real meaning underneath the word in the title. The Watchers did not fear the Australians because of some campfire legend about supernatural killers. If there was a dread, it was the far more unsettling kind that comes from a tool that suddenly stops working. Imagine being the eyes of an army, trusted to give the warning that keeps everyone else alive, and being good at it, genuinely good, for years. You can read the land. You can feel when soldiers are near. You have never let an American column slip past you unannounced. And then there is this one kind of enemy, this small silent kind that can be inside your area, watching your own people, learning your patterns, and be gone again. And the first you know of it is when an ambush you never reported takes apart a group of fighters who believed that stretch of jungle was safe. For a system built entirely on the promise of seeing the enemy first, the existence of an enemy it could not see was not just a tactical problem. It was a quiet, creeping fear that the one thing you were certain of, that you would always have warning, might not be true after all. I want to stop here for a moment because this is exactly the kind of history that almost no one tells properly. And the only reason it survives is if people decide it should. If a story like this, two completely opposite ways of waging war meeting in the same jungle, told with respect for both sides, is the kind of thing you think deserves to be remembered, then stop right now and subscribe, and leave the words "long-haired army" in the comments. This subject gets buried under cheaper, lazier versions, and the only thing that pushes the serious one in front of new people is you. One tap. Do it now, because the most important part of this story is the part the cheap versions always get wrong. Because here is where most tellings of anything to do with the women of the Viet Cong go astray, and where this one is going to do the opposite. It would be easy and dishonest to reduce the long-haired army to a curiosity, a novelty, a footnote with a striking image attached. That is not what they were. These women were a serious, formidable, and effective adversary. They endured conditions that would break most people. They carried crushing loads over brutal terrain. They held their nerve as watchers and couriers, knowing that capture meant interrogation, imprisonment, or worse. They fought, and many of them died, for a cause they believed in as fiercely as any soldier on the other side believed in his. To treat them as anything less than what they were, real combatants in a real war, would not only be unfair to them, it would actually make this story smaller and weaker. Because here is the thing about the duel we have been describing. The SAS were not testing their skill against a weak or foolish enemy. They were testing it against one of the most effective intelligence and early warning systems any guerrilla movement has ever built, run by people who were patient, observant, and brave. And that is exactly what makes the achievement of the Phantoms mean something. It is easy to slip past a careless enemy. To slip past this one, to move unseen through a landscape engineered specifically to see you against watchers this good, that is the measure of just how extraordinary the SAS craft really was. You do not honor the ghosts by belittling the network they had to beat. You honor them by taking that network as seriously as they had to. So when you picture this hidden duel, do not picture a cliche. Picture two kinds of mastery, opposed and evenly matched in their own ways. On one side, a woman who has spent her whole life in this landscape, who can read it like a language, who notices the single wrong detail in a scene that looks perfectly ordinary, and who has saved her comrades' lives more times than she can count by simply paying attention. On the other, a soldier who has trained for years to produce no wrong detail at all, who can lie in the brush a few meters from a trail and let that same woman walk past without ever knowing he was there. Two people, each a master of opposite arts, each formidable, locked in a silent contest that left almost no trace in the records precisely because the whole point for both of them was to leave no trace. The Watcher's triumph was an enemy reported and an ambush sprung. The Ghost's triumph was a watcher who looked right at his position and saw nothing but jungle. Most of the time, in most of the country, the Watchers won, and the Americans paid for it. But in the narrow, specialized world of the SAS patrol, the balance tipped the other way, and the all-seeing network met the one enemy it could not see. That is the true story behind a clickbait-sounding title, and it is a far better one than the title promises. It is not about fear. It is about the meeting of two of the most refined skills the war produced. the watching and the vanishing, and about a force of women whose role was so central and so consistently written out of the story afterward that most people watching this have never once heard them named. And that is the thread worth pulling as we close, because it points to something larger. We have spent this series telling the stories of forgotten allies and overlooked soldiers, the Koreans, the Australians, the men history skipped past. But the enemy had its forgotten figures too, and some of them were every bit as remarkable as anyone on the other side. The long-haired army did not simply appear. It was built, organized, and led, and the person most responsible for shaping the role of women in the Southern struggle was herself a woman, one who rose from a colonial prison to become one of the most senior commanders the insurgency ever had, and a name that almost no one in the West has ever heard. To understand the enemy that the Australians, the Americans, and the Koreans were really fighting, you have to understand her. And that is the story we are telling next.